As you know, we have had an almost complete blackout from the press about our activities today. We've had minor items on inside pages about some, just a brief statement of what's happening, or if they do give us space, as Jim Droney did in his column last night, it's in an attempt to belittle what we're trying to do and to suggest that we really don't amount to very much and there are very few people who are interested. But seeing the group that we have here at the moment and knowing how many more are coming in during the day, I hope Mr. Droney is going to put in an appearance at some time and see just how wrong he is in the assumptions he's made in that column. So in order also to show that this is not entirely an outside New England affair, we have asked individual members of our list of sponsors to undertake the pleasant task of introducing the moderator for the occasion. And this morning, it's a great satisfaction to me that Robert Montgomery, one of our sponsors, has agreed to introduce Dr. Root, who is going to be the moderator. Now, I'm sure with this crowd, I don't have to tell you who Robert Montgomery is. Some people might confuse him with a famous actor, but not any of those who have read his book on Sacco Vanzetti, The Murder and the Myth, and know what a thoroughly and scholarly job he did in destroying all the arguments against the results of that particular trial. And Mr. Montgomery is one of our outstanding conservatives here. He was one of the people who helped get the idea of this rally launched. I don't need to tell you that the basic idea came from two Boston policemen who got together with Anna McKinney and decided something should be done and proceeded to do it. And then they got hold of Mr. Montgomery and one or two other people, and that was the way the thing started. And we are delighted that so many people have followed our lead, and it's a pleasure indeed to have Mr. Montgomery here this morning to start things off. Thank you very much.
I performed two functions this morning. The first one is to let all of you fine people from Puerto Rico, California, Texas, and the rest of the United States know that there is one conservative living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The other function is less necessary because the introduction of Merrill Root to you, to this very sophisticated audience, is hardly necessary. But perhaps I should tell some of our Massachusetts people here who Professor Root is. Merrill Root is a poet, an author, an educator, and one of the most courageous fighters in the battle for the mind of our youth. His two great books, The Brainwashing in the High Schools and Collectivism on the Campus, should really be read by all of you as an introduction to him. And they will terrify you, those of you who have children or grandchildren to educate, and perhaps those of you who have been through the education that he describes so well and so frighteningly in these two books. He is going to be our moderator this morning, and you will know from what he says how sincere, how courageous, and how effective he is in this battle for the mind. Dr. Root.
It is indeed an honor to be introduced by one of the finest men and the finest minds that I know, and I greatly appreciate this beautiful introduction. I'm sure this morning we can say in the words of the old song, "Lift up your heads and shout, it's a great day." There are no more beautiful words in all the language than God, family, and country. There are no greater deeds than to affirm and to defend God, family, and country. And we are gathered together this morning in a time of collectivist slavery and of liberal insanity to affirm once more sanity and freedom. Now, in doing so, I think there are two things that I should stress briefly. One is that in this struggle, we enlist every inch, every ounce, and every atom of our being. It is said that when the great Douglas of Scotland went on the crusade, he bore with him the heart of Robert Bruce in a golden case. And in one of his most desperate struggles, he took that heart and he cast it ahead of him, and as he charged the enemy, he said he would recover it or he would die. That is our spirit today. But also in our struggle, we must always have, and I am sure we do, a spirit of humor, of good humor, of wit, of gallantry, and even of gaiety. And I'm reminded of a story that the late James Stephens, the Irish poet, loved to tell. He said that once upon a time in Dublin, Ireland, there was an old woman, bent and feeble and worn, who tried to climb onto a tramcar. Now the conductor was a gallant young Irishman. He was courteous and he was helpful, but I'm afraid he was a liberal. That is, I think, he was too proud of what he too fondly thought were his brains. And so he said, "Old mother, if you had yeast in your bones, you'd rise quicker." And in a flash she turned to him and she said, "Yes, young man, and if you'd had better raisin, you'd be better bred." Now, I think all our speakers this morning and all our activities in this great rally will be designed to bring about that the generations of America shall have better raisin and that the liberal shall be better bred. Now, as one who will set the very tone of our gathering, I will introduce one who is indeed a representative of the true spirit of religion. Our Lord once said that when he came to the earth, would he find faith? We have one this morning who indeed has that faith. And it is my privilege, my honor, and my pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Andrew Van Groll, advisor for the American Education Council, who will set the religious mood for our rally.
Well, before I begin my talk, I would like to express my appreciation to His Eminence Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Catholic Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Boston. For it is with his kind permission that I appear as the lead-off man at this rally. Perhaps the reason for my position is that after hearing my roundabout rambling, you'll appreciate all the more Frank Capel's straightforward reporting. At least I always look forward to receiving Frank Capel's Herald of Freedom in my mail every other week. Frank didn't put me up to this. I don't get paid for this commercial. No, I just wanted to pay tribute to Frank because he is responsible for my conversion. In large part, he is. And he's also the man who was instrumental in getting me to join up with the retired Army officers, prosperous businessmen, and little old ladies wearing tennis shoes. Now, although I cannot ascertain with certainty the Cardinal's reasons for granting me permission to speak, I would hazard a guess that they probably spring from his own well-known feelings of strong pro-Americanism and staunch anti-communism. And I feel it is only fitting that I pay tribute to this great American churchman, especially since one would have to look long and well to find a man who is more dedicated to the threefold theme of this rally for God, family, and country. Now, since my talk is supposed to be basically in the nature of a prayer, I have divided it into 3 parts. The first part is a very brief invocation. The second part is a somewhat longer but hopefully lofty meditation. That is, if one uses the word meditation in a rather broad sense. And as would be expected at any gathering of a conservative clan such as this, the third part is what I suppose the liberal left-wing lunatics would call a rabble-rousing and radical right-wing benediction. Well, now, I would ask those of you who are guided by an ancient admonition of sacred Scripture, rather than by a recent and, as some say, indecent decision of the Supreme Court, to stand up and to follow along mentally while I read the following prayer as an invocation. O God, from whom proceed all holy desires, right counsels, and just works, we humbly beseech you to bless us who are gathered here in your holy name. For in these days when the patriotism of many has grown cold, we have come to proclaim with pride our love and our loyalty to this land which we have received from your bounty. We have come to protest that, contrary to the opinion of some, love of country still remains a virtue most pleasing in your eyes. And finally, we have come to promise to promote and to defend those inalienable rights with which you have endowed and ennobled the heart of man: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Amen. Now, if you'll please be seated again, I will give you the meditation part of my talk, the subject of which is the virtue of patriotism or love of country. Now, since I believe in giving credit where credit is due, I must acknowledge that in my choice of this subject, I was inspired, negatively that is, by the fact that recently at a high school on Long Island, some 20-odd students, and I mean odd in more ways than one, refused to pledge their allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. In fact, one student even went so far as to say that he will not salute any flag until one flag flies over the entire world. And obviously he was not referring to the Stars and Stripes, to which he refuses to pledge his allegiance. But possibly, or even probably, he was referring to the hammer and sickle. For isn't this the flag of those who are so diligently and so deceitfully working for one world government? Now, since today is the birthday of our republic, perhaps I would do well to make a few comments on this truly tragic incident. At least I consider it such. With Americans such as these, we don't need any outside enemies. For should such an unpatriotic attitude ever become prevalent in our wonderful republic, then we become our own worst enemies. And as a result, it will follow as the night follows the day, that another great nation will pursue the path of previous civilizations by falling from within. Now, to prevent this from happening, and it could very easily happen, in fact, some say it is happening, and that we're at a very advanced stage in the takeover, and I agree with that opinion, or rather that fact. Well, anyway, to prevent this from happening, we must revive what some would call the reactionary teaching that patriotism is a virtue. For only by putting into practice this teaching will we be able to live up to General MacArthur's marvelous motto, duty, honor, country. And it is only so long as we live up to the lofty ideals of this truly great American hero that our beloved land will be bright with freedom's holy light. For I think, as Tom Anderson tells us in one of his talks, when that bright light of freedom fails, good men and women rot in jails, and they who cried, appease, appease, are hanged by those they tried to please. A second source of inspiration, again negatively, for this meditation on patriotism is contained in a somewhat recent message of J. Edgar Hoover to law enforcement officers. Among other things, this dedicated director of the FBI reported a high school editor who wrote, and I ruefully quote, "Patriotism has outlived its usefulness." Now again, since today is the 4th of July, our greatest national holiday, perhaps I would do well to make a few comments on this mouthful of nonsense, dangerous nonsense. And first of all, I would note that this student's sophisticated and sophomoric statement is a far cry from that sublime and splendid spirit of '76 which we honor and so gratefully today. Secondly, I would say that there are few things more ridiculous and dangerous than a train of thought that carries no freight. And this student, who apparently suffers from constipation of thought and diarrhea of words, which I might add is a rather common affliction today, he also reminds me of the following little poem entitled Gift of Gab. The art of logical thought was far beyond his reach, but not, unfortunately, the power of speech. He also reminds me of Artemus Ward's definition of ignorance. Ignorance, he once wrote, does not mean not knowing, but knowing so many things that ain't so. It's too bad this young man had to spend so much time learning so many things that ain't so. Let's hope and pray he lives long enough to unlearn much of what he has so falsely and foolishly learned. You know, I think people like that would be much better off being totally uninformed than being so grossly misinformed. My only other comment on this student's lack of logic and loyalty is J. Edgar Hoover's own comment on his wild and witless words. This great watchdog of the Republic said, "God forbid that such misguided observations should reflect the reasoning of any sizable segment of our youth." To which I add a fervent amen. Now, a third and final negative source of inspiration for this patriotic meditation. Remember, I said I'm using the word meditation in the broad sense, and I do suffer from that human frailty of being plagued by distractions at prayer, so there may be a few as we go along. It's human weakness, you know. Well, anyway, the third source of inspiration negatively is an article that appeared some months ago in the Saturday Evening Worker, or rather, Saturday Evening Post. Sorry. Well, you can't blame me for that one. The two, you do get them mixed up, huh? Well, anyway, the article was entitled America the Smug. And the author of the article, whom I regret to say is a clergyman, set for himself the task of pointing out that we Americans are not as virtuous as we like to think. And to prove his points, he cites a number of examples from our national history, both past and present. Well, now, any American who is capable of being honest with himself will readily agree that we as a people have no monopoly on virtue. If anyone entertains such an illusion, all he has to do is read the crime reports in our daily papers. Such a sobering experience may not only shatter his illusion, it may also lead him to the opposite conclusion. Indeed, he may figure that what St. Paul wrote to the Cretans applies also to the Americans. Always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. But seriously, any American who is conversant with our national history will be forced to admit that there are some skeletons in our country's closet. And although this is something to be lamented, it is also something to be expected. For those of us who are still old-fashioned enough to believe in the doctrine of original sin are painfully and personally aware of the fact that we belong to a fallen, albeit redeemed, human race. And even those who reject this doctrine of original sin must accept the fact that somewhere along the line something went wrong with human nature. Some kind of fly of discord entered into the ointment of man's bliss. And that's where the communists make their basic fallacy. They'll never have a heaven on earth because man has a wounded nature. You know, the day will never dawn, despite the fact of the marvelous advances we have made in science and technology. The day will never dawn when we'll discover to our delight that we have become paragons of perfection. For perfection is a property of eternity and not a quality of time. All we can do in this life is try to approximate perfection. Now, I may be wrong on that point. For perhaps when the present administration wins its war against poverty, it might declare a war on sin. And you know, when that happens, I'm going to leave the conservative clan and join the liberal camp. Because as a clergyman, I am inalterably opposed to sin. Indeed, with the most starry-eyed do-gooders, I firmly believe that Congress is long overdue in passing a law forbidding sin. And, of course, appropriating the proper financial, money that has to go with it to enforce that law, huh? Poor God, it's a crying shame he doesn't have money. Because he's been against sin ever since Adam and Eve violated his property rights by going apple picking in his orchard. I bet he'll be happy to see the social planners succeed where he has failed. Huh? Then on second thought, we don't have to worry too much about making God happy because he can't vote in the November elections. He lost his residence by being kicked out of our schools. But to return to the article in the Saturday Evening Post, although the author makes some valid points that are well taken by any American who is interested in his country's welfare, or rather well-being. For some reason, I don't like that word, welfare. Nevertheless, I fail to see the value of articles such as this. In fact, I'm getting more than a wee bit sick and tired of being told to beat my breast because I'm an American. I feel that in these days when the word patriotism has become a dirty word in the minds of many misguided Americans, what we need is less breast beating and more chest thumping and flag waving in this wonderful, albeit imperfect republic of ours. What we need is less apology for our imperfections and more pride over our ideals. What we need is less downgrading and degrading of our national heroes in our history books and more living of our American heritage in our daily lives. In a word, what we need is the writing of fewer articles such as America the Smug and the singing of more songs such as America the Beautiful. I said that the word patriotism has become a dirty word in the minds of many misguided Americans. And sad to say, such it has. But thank God such was not always the case. Otherwise, I fear we would not be holding this rally here. Or we would be holding it, but instead of starting out by singing the Star-Spangled Banner, we would have started out by singing God Save the Queen. Or, heaven forbid, the International. Now, fortunately for us, there was a time when all Americans considered patriotism to be a virtue. And of course, such it still remains today. For neither the passage of time nor the philosophy of expediency possesses the power to transform a virtue into a vice. And of course, vice versa. They cannot change a vice into a virtue, which is what some people are literally hell-bent on trying to do today. My old pal Bill Shakespeare would have said, if he had thought of it, what's in a name? That which we call a sin by any other name would stink as much. You know, those of us who are still conservative enough to accept the Judeo-Christian code of conduct, we know that moral principles are absolute and immutable, and consequently they are not decided by the ever-changing mores or customs of society. Rather, they are determined by the never-changing laws of nature and nature's God. Now that this is rapidly becoming a reactionary viewpoint, no one who has access to a modern magazine or newspaper can doubt. For in these days of high living and low morals, a la Bobby Baker, Billy Solestis, etc., etc., much of the scandal that we read about in our daily press is the direct result of making man, and not God, the arbiter or judge of what is right and what is wrong. And we know that when we place human preferences above and before divine principles, then the road is open to all sorts of liberal thinking and licentious behavior. But rather than pursue such an unpleasant subject on such a pleasant day as this, let us return to the virtue of patriotism. Now, to prove that patriotism is a virtue is to labor the obvious. But then oftentimes the obvious needs to be labored, especially in these days when the laws of logic are honored more in their breach than in their observance, and when common sense has become a rather rare commodity. Just last night at the press conference, a little girl from the press asked me what I was going to talk about. And I said the virtue of patriotism or love of country. Well, she said, it's obvious, everybody knows that. And I said, is it? No. At least the 20 students out in Long Island, it wasn't obvious to them, huh? Or that editor of that high school newspaper, or that author of that article in the Saturday Evening Post. So let me just review some basic principles and fundamental truths. And we'll do that by seeing what some great religious leaders have had to say on the subject of patriotism. And as lead-off man, we have no less an authority than St. Thomas Aquinas. In his Summa Theologica, he has a paragraph that should be of more than passing interest to those who are agitating for the surrender of our national sovereignty to a brave new world government. In fact, it should give them cause for pause and reason for worry. For in it, St. Thomas considers patriotism as part and parcel of the virtue of piety. Now, if I may, I would very much like to read what St. Thomas has to say, for I think he sums up very nicely the triple theme of this rally for God, family, and country. With a logic that is lacking in much of the liberal thinking of today, St. Thomas tells us, man becomes a debtor to other men in various ways, according to their various excellence and the various benefits received from them. On both counts, God holds first place, for he is supremely excellent and is for us the first principle of being and government. In the second place, the principles of our being and government are our parents and our country that have given us birth and nourishment. Consequently, man is debtor chiefly to his parents and his country after God. Wherefore, just as it belongs to religion to give worship to God, so does it belong to piety in the second place to give worship to one's parents and one's country. So we see, according to the mind of St. Thomas, and his was a truly great mind, the virtue of piety is that virtue by which we render to our parents and to our country that worship or honor which is their due. It is one virtue with two objects, parents and country, and both objects are worthy of our honor, because, as St. Thomas says, after God, they are the principles or sources of our very being. Indeed, our parents gave us the great gift of life, and that tender, loving care, without which we would have perished at birth. And our country gave us a place in which to be born. It also gave us a status as a citizen with certain rights and corresponding duties. And I might just stress here the idea of corresponding duties. For today there's such a hue and cry over human rights or civil rights that we tend to forget that inherent in any human right there lies a corresponding obligation or duty. Finally, every day of our lives, our country affords us the protection and sometimes the persecution of its laws. We might say that both our parents and our country share in the paternity of God in our behalf. And we must say that they have a strict right to the honor and love we owe to them. Now, as with our love for our parents, so with our love for our country. It is not only an obligation of justice, it is also an attitude of mind and a disposition of heart. And perhaps these are best summed up by the word fatherland and all that this beautiful word implies. And among other things, it implies that we know and love our country's history and heroes, that we honor and obey its laws and statutes, that we esteem and emulate its ideals and aspirations, that we respect and revere its customs and traditions, that we work and pray for its peace and prosperity, that we criticize and correct its faults and failings, and finally, if need be, that we fight and even die for its freedom and sovereignty. Now, I might just stress here the duty, and it is a duty, to correct our country's faults and failings. Indeed, at times we must be to what some may seem unpatriotic in order to be truly patriotic. This is not a contradiction, it is a paradox. Yes, it is the paradox of the patriot who, for example, speaks out against the State Department's dismissal of a loyal patriot whose only crime was that he placed national security above departmental secrecy. And I say if this be a crime, then what this country needs and needs badly are more criminals. Now, my dear friends, such public criticism does not imply national disloyalty any more than self-criticism implies self-hatred. Quite to the contrary. A person who really loves himself will criticize himself, for he knows that self-criticism leads to self-knowledge and self-correction, whereas self-complacency leads to self-ignorance and self-corruption. And in this matter, ignorance is not bliss. For as someone has said, and said very well, if ignorance is bliss, then why am I so unhappy? Now, as with individuals, so with nations. They also need a voice of conscience to uphold them when they are right and to upbraid them when they are wrong. And it is one of the duties of the true patriot to serve as his country's conscience. For contrary to the opinion of some, our country is not an aristocracy of whiz kids in Washington who consider the people incapable of governing themselves and who consider themselves unaccountable to the people, or as they would probably say, the peasants or hoi polloi. Rather, our country is, as a great American has said, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. At least that is the way it was set up by our founding fathers. Just how long it will remain that way is, I think, definitely debatable. And that is why another great American keeps reminding us, this is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. Perhaps the paradox of the patriot is best clarified by an authoritative statement made by a former President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, whose big stick policy we are so sadly in need of today, had some very sane and sensible words to say on the subject. But before quoting him, I wish to acknowledge that for this particular quotation, I'm indebted to a book written by a fellow with whom I intend to have dinner tonight. I hope to be joined by about 500 or 600 other people. You know, it's always nice to have an intimate family gathering or get-together on the 4th of July. It's one of those good old American customs. However, before you decide to come to this dinner party, I feel I should warn you that this fellow is a real fanatic. I'm going to prove that to you. For among other things, he believes, now get this, he actually believes in the statement, in fact, I think he invented it, less government, more responsibility, and a better world. Well, you gods, how fanatical can a person get? You know, that's almost as bad as singing Yankee Doodle Dandy on the 4th of July or singing Dixie in the terrace room as Mary Kane and I Hummed Along last night, you know. It's really almost subversive behavior. You know, on second thought, I don't know if I'm going to come to this dinner tonight because after being subjected to such a steady diet of shoddy and sloppy and silly liberal thinking in so much of our daily press, this man's common sense might cause me indigestion by upsetting my stomach, might be too rich and rare for me, see? So instead of coming to the hotel Grand Ballroom here tonight, I might just mosey over to Cape Bridge and settle for some eggplants and half-baked clams. Or rather, eggplants and baked clams on the hash shell. I better put my glasses on and stick to the text here. Well, meanwhile, back at the White House, after all, we left Teddy Roosevelt waiting there. Here's what he had to say on the subject of patriotism and the presidency. Quote, patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president or any other public official, save exactly to the degree in which he himself stands by the country. It is patriotic to support him insofar as he efficiently serves the country. It is unpatriotic not to oppose him to the exact extent that by inefficiency or otherwise he fails in his duty to stand by the country. In either You know, my feelings are hurt. You clap whenever I give you a good quotation, either from Robert Welch or Teddy Roosevelt, but not from me. Well, Teddy Roosevelt continues, in either event, It is unpatriotic not to tell the truth, whether about the president or anyone else, save in the rare cases where this would make known to the enemy information of military value which would otherwise be unknown to him. Thus spoke former President Theodore Roosevelt. And I have only two comments to make on his words of wisdom. The first is in the form of a rhetorical question. How long, O Lord, how long must the loyal opposition be ridiculed by being called hate-mongers, simply because they possess the patriotism to oppose the loose thinking of the liberal establishment? My second comment is after the fashion of an academic citation. O freedom of the press, what crimes are committed in thy name? For you allow the enemies of liberty to exploit liberty for its destruction, and you ridicule and smear loyal patriots who are fighting to preserve our American way of life. You know, New York Times might like that quote. Now, don't knock the New York Times anymore, because last week my name appeared on page 35. And I'll tell you what happened. You might find this interesting. There was an accident about a block. I am from Manhattan, and a block away a building collapsed, and 3 men were caught in the debris, and they were digging them out. And after about a half hour, they got the first man out. He looked very critical to me. Subsequently, thank God, I found out it was superficial wounds. But as he was carried into the emergency room, I asked him, "Are you a Catholic?" I would have given him the last rites then. And he looked at me, and with a typical liberal thinking, he said, "Mister, I'm an atheist, but the good Lord was with me today." Now, I have here a number of quotations from papal encyclicals that I would love to read to you today, but we're running out of time. Perhaps it's just as well, because maybe by just quoting from Catholic writings I might set the ecumenical movement back by about 50 years, which just goes to show ignorance is not bliss. So I think we'll have to skip over that. I'm sorry to do so, because today it's good to hear some great religious leaders remind us that patriotism is a virtue, especially Pope Pius. In one of these quotations, it seems he took to task the global planners and one world people. He mentions that there were some who were even trying to do away with the word fatherland, and he regretted it. He said it is one more sign, and not the least important, of a loss of direction on the part of modern men. But here I would like to give you 2 quotations from a great American bishop of the last century, Archbishop Ireland. And I do this for the sake of the Catholics here, because, although it pains me to say it, some of them are among those many misguided Americans who consider patriotism to be a dirty word. The Catholic Church, wrote the Archbishop, commands and consecrates patriotism. The true Catholic must needs be the true patriot. In the eyes of the Church, loyalty to country is loyalty to God. Patriotism is a heavenly virtue, a high and holy form of obedience. The patriot dying for his country wears the halo of the martyr. And the Archbishop also wrote, and again I quote, "Next to God is country, and next to religion is patriotism." Patriotism is a Catholic virtue. I would have Catholics be the first patriots of the land. Now, when he says it's a Catholic virtue, he doesn't mean specifically. It's one we all should have. Well, now, I want to skip over some more here. I was going to bring out a point how the virtue of patriotism can become a vice, like any virtue can, either in one of 2 ways, either by excess or by defect. It becomes a vice by excess when one becomes guilty of excessive nationalism. For example, the chauvinistic statement, "my country, right or wrong." That's an example of excessive nationalism. It is opposed to true patriotism, which, as we have seen, strives to right its country's wrong. Then we had the example of excessive nationalism with Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan of some 20, 25 years ago. In fact, we fought a war with these countries precisely, or shall I say presumably, because of their excessive and aggressive nationalism. And finally, we had the splendid isolation of days gone by. Now, this also has ceased to exist, not by reason of a war, but by reason of a world grown smaller because of human progress. Now, just because some individuals and even entire nations abuse the benefits and blessings of true patriotism by becoming guilty of excessive nationalism, we should not condemn something that is good and necessary in itself. That would be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, or burning down the barn because of the rats to get rid of them, Or, as some are agitating, confiscating our firearms because a communist killed our president. Take away theirs. We might need ours to defend ourselves someday. You know, those who belong to the one world school of thought might think this seems rather logical, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But it isn't. It's downright foolish. You see, when we think maturely, we judge a thing not by its occasional abuses, but by its essential nature. And by its essential nature, patriotism is a virtue. Corruption in any of the arts can tear down rather than build up, and the same is true of the art of patriotism. But just as we don't blame beauty because of this corruption, so we should not find fault with patriotism because it sometimes goes awry. Now, I'd just like to make one final point here. I'm skipping over some more material. I didn't know just what was expected of me. See, I prepared a long talk. It took me about 5 minutes yet. You see, it's rare I get on the loose. And when I do, it's like taking your finger out of the dike, see? So, give me 5 minutes yet, Anna? All right. I always ask her because even these three gentlemen, she's the power behind the throne, see? It strikes me that there are those who are too busy bending over backward in their efforts to love the entire human or world community. And consequently, they sin against the virtue of patriotism by defect. Sometimes I can't help wondering whether a nation is not better off being our enemy than being our friend. For as a citizen of one of our allies recently said in reference to the State Department, with friends like the United States, who needs enemies? And perhaps the so-called good communist, Comrade Tito, reasons the opposite. With enemies like the United States, who needs friends? We have an obligation to love all men, even our enemies. The popes point that out, and we know that from reading the scriptures. But I might just point out in passing here that the obligation to love all men, even our enemies, does not mean that we must provide them with the means to bury us. And that is precisely what the Russian bear, or to avoid insulting bears, let us say butcher, for that's what he is, has pledged himself to do. Indeed, time and again he has said loud and clear for all to hear, "We will bury you." And who knows, perhaps he will. For who was it who said all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing? I wouldn't mind so much if we just sat back and did nothing. But I hate like hell to think that we're helping the cause of communism along by giving positive aid and comfort to the enemy. With the very same shovels that we're putting wheat into those bags for Mr. K, we're digging our own graves. And to my mind, that's adding insult to injury. Now, I know some will say that by giving wheat to Comrade Nikita and company, we will change their minds about their ultimate goal. That's one of the illusions of the liberals. They're going to, not worry about world domination. And so they argue, let's not, or rather, they won't bite the hand that feeds them. Well, my answer to this line of reasoning, if one can call it that, is this. That may be true of dogs. But unfortunately, we are not dealing with friendly dogs. We are dealing with ferocious dictators. And in our dealing with them, we would do well to take Demosthenes as our guide, for he wisely warns us there is one safeguard known generally to the wise, which is an advantage and security to all, but especially to democracies or republics as against dictators. What is it? Distrust. You know, we must always remember that it is not peaceful coexistence that is the price of liberty. In fact, peaceful coexistence, some call it surrender on the installment plan. No, it is eternal vigilance that is the price of liberty. And this is especially true when we are dealing with dictators who believe that promises are like pie crusts made to be broken. You know, Pope John the 23rd has called history that great teacher of life. But again, unfortunately, there are those who forget, or better prefer not to remember, that the history of the Soviet Union is but one sad and cynical spectacle of broken promises. And as an American philosopher puts it, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And with what result? Perhaps with the result described by an English statesman who once wrote, "The condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance, which condition if he break, servitude is at once the consequence of his crime and the punishment of his guilt." You know, according to Christian teaching, and I would imagine that Jewish teaching is the same, the obligation to love all men, even our enemies, simply means this, that we wish all our fellow human beings well, both in this life and the life to come, that we show them the common signs of goodwill, and that if they are in need, we come to their aid if we are able to do so. But not, as I've taken pains to point out, if this means digging our own grave in the process. And that is why, in days gone by, armies used to lay siege to cities in order to starve their inhabitants into submission and surrender. And this was acceptable not only from a military standpoint, but from a moral standpoint. For although charity is or should be universal, it is also prudent. You know, it is one of my opinions, 2 more minutes and I'll be through. It's one of my opinions, wise or otherwise, so take it for what it's worth, that there are too many professional do-gooders running around loose in the world today. These are the characters, and believe you me, they are characters, who love the masses but despise the individual. They talk eloquently about the brotherhood of man, but refuse to converse civilly with their next-door neighbor. I think Taylor Caldwell, in one of her articles in American Opinion, describes them very well. Now, on a larger scale, there are the global planners who spout forth on the necessity of one world government, but who have lost all love and loyalty for their own land. Not only do they profane the principle of subsidiarity, they also, and what is worse, violate the virtue of patriotism. Such characters always remind me of G.K. Chesterton's poem entitled The World State. And just to show you that their idea of world federalism is nothing new, permit me to read this poem to you. With tongue-in-cheek, Chesterton writes, "Oh, how I love humanity, with love so pure and Pringlish, and how I hate the horrid French, who never will be English. The international idea, the largest and the clearest, is welding all the nations now, except the one that's nearest. This compromise has long been known, this scheme of partial pardons, in ethical societies and small suburban gardens. The villas and the chapels where I learned with little labor the way to love my fellow man and hate my next-door neighbor." Now, by an association of opposite ideas, G.K. Chesterton's clever satire on world federalism calls to mind Sir Walter Scott's beautiful tribute to his native land. And I can think of no better way of concluding the meditation part of my talk than by reading these words. I'm sorry I don't have them memorized. One time I did. We used to have to memorize them in school. "Praised there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, 'This is my own, my native land, whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned from wandering on a foreign strand. If such there breathe, go, mark him well, for him no minstrel raptures swell. High though his titles, proud his name, boundless his wealth as wish can claim, despite those titles, power, and pelf, the wretch consented all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Now, if it doesn't violate your religious convictions or run counter to any Supreme Court decision around here, I would ask you all to stand up again and to follow along mentally while I recite the following prayer as a benediction. O God, whom to know is to live, and whom to serve is to reign, grant that we may always strive to do your will, for only in your will is our peace. And we do want peace, a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. But we do not want a peace that must be purchased with the price of freedom, for we do not profess the pessimistic philosophy, better red than dead. This to us is a cowardly admission of defeat before the battle has even begun, and a cravenly attitude of despair, which every loyal American should shun. For we believe that long after the red star has descended on the far horizon of human history, and there has joined the black swastika as not just another grim reminder of man's inhumanity to man, this nation, under God, shall continue to enjoy a new birth of freedom, and our star-spangled banner will yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. We also believe that there are worse things than dying. Indeed, far worse than dying a death of honor in the defense of our country is living a life of shame in the sight of our children. And that is why, despite the hue and cry of the apostles of appeasement who want peace at any price, we resolutely refuse to betray our bright birthright of bravery for the so-called security of slavery. For unlike some who are willing to sacrifice their sacred trust, we do not hold life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. Rather than pay such a price, O God, we are prepared to put on the armor of light and to fight the good fight for the freedom of this land we love. And aided with your help from on high, we will fight bravely, and if need be, even die, in our effort to keep this a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Indeed, as long as there are those who insist on threatening with a flash of lightning on the left, so long will we persist in resounding with a roar of thunder on the right. For we want to preserve and pass on to our posterity our precious and priceless American heritage. For we know that only if our children are free Americans will they be able to enjoy the right and the privilege and the obligation of knowing and loving and serving you here in order to be happy with you forever hereafter. Amen. Thank you for your attention. God bless you. And in the words of William Shakespeare, God bless this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this America.